Hello there. This next video is a look at the Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon based blend Concha y Toro donmelchor 2022. And this is the last of the videos in the series covering my trip from Auckland to London with Emirates. Now, those of you who might have been following this series have probably already realised that I've covered Concha y Toro's donmelchor 2022 before, with a recording of a tasting that I did on the business class leg of my flight from Dubai to London. So please excuse the repetition, but actually an opportunity arose. As far as my flight was concerned, I'd actually been delayed in Auckland and as a result missed my onward connection to London and was rebooked for the afternoon's flight. So I had plenty of time in the business class lounge to record a number of tastings, and one of the wines that I tasted in the lounge was donmelchor 2022. Looking at the series, initially to me it made more sense to publish the tasting that I'd recorded on the plane. However, a user, Dave8076, commented on my initial video that he'd love to know what the wine tasted like on the ground by comparison. So I thought this was an opportunity to actually show some of that and to give a little bit of analysis as to how the taste of the wine differed. There are differences in the way wines taste at altitude. My understanding is that the air pressure alters your perception of acidity, and thus wines seem less sharp and less tart. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to compare how a particular wine tasted on the ground in Dubai in the Emirates Lounge with how it tasted in a business class seat at 38,000 feet above sea level. Hello there. Today I'm in Emirates Business Class Lounge in the terminal at Dubai. I'm currently flying from Auckland through to London, and I have quite a long stop over here, so it gives me the chance to try some of the fabulous wines they've got on display here. Also perhaps to fill in a gap. I love watching people doing flight reviews and travel videos. While I think people like Non-Stop Dan or Noel Phillips do a great job, it does seem to me that they get to the wines and they tend to pass those by. I don't think Non-Stop Dan drinks alcohol at all, so I thought I might try and do something to redress that. So here in my glass I have a Chilean wine. This is Concha y Toro's donmelchor 2022. Donmelchor is a premium label for Concha y Toro, one of South America's largest wine producers. Donmelchor is a significant wine for Chile because it was the first Chilean wine to be featured in Wine Spectator magazine's annual Top 100 Wine selection. The wine is named for somebody called Donmelchor de Concha y Toro. He was the founder of Concha y Toro. He was a businessman who imported vines from Bordeaux and planted them in the Maipo region in the 1880s. So this is pre-phylloxera. Now the donmelchor vineyard was planted in 1890, again on its own roots. The vines had been imported before phylloxera had reached Bordeaux, and phylloxera thus far has not reached Chile. And the current vineyard, although not the original vines, is actually planted with a massal selection, a selection of cuttings from the best of these old vines. The vineyard here is quite sizable. It covers about 127 hectares, and the majority of that is planted to Cabernet Sauvignon, at least 90%. But they say there's 7.1% of Cabernet Franc and 1% of Petit Verdot. So I would assume the extra couple of percent missing from that is actually also Cabernet Sauvignon. And vine age in the vineyard is currently a quite impressive 35 years. The fruit is hand-picked into crates with a 10 kilogram capacity. The idea of that being to avoid damage to the fruit at the bottom by making sure there's not lots of fruit on top to crush it on its way to the winery, because that would encourage oxidation. At the winery they say a double selection is performed. So first of all they'll pick out the best bunches and then they'll pick out individual berries. The wine is crushed and ferments in stainless steel tanks. Temperatures are kept down to just 25 to 26 degrees Celsius to prevent over-extraction of harsh tannins. Fermentation goes on for about 8 to 10 days. During the fermentation stage, they'll pump juice from the bottom of the tank back over the skins at the top. And at the beginning of the fermentation, they'll do that 3 times a day, so that during the entire day, the whole volume of the tank is pumped over. In the second half of the ferment, they'll reduce that sort of initially to half the tank being pumped over in a day, and then eventually just to a third being pumped over in a day. But that's done according to the extraction that's going on. At the end of that fermentation, the tank is then hermetically sealed, temperatures kept at 23 to 25 degrees C, and maceration's allowed to continue, but at a temperature where it's only quite smooth tannins that are being extracted. The wine ages in French oak barrels, I would assume those are barriques, but that's not actually stated anywhere in the literature I've managed to find. And the wine ages in those for 15 months. Of those, 68% are new and 32% of second use. The notes I've got suggest the wine has a drinking window that should start in 2028 and carry on until 2045. So this may be a little young to approach as of yet. Looking at it though, we have a really deep, dark, opaque colour. There's still a touch of purple at the rim. It's not blue, I mean it's a red purple. It holds its colour very well to the rim. This is a well pigmented wine. Swirling it, according to the label, this has 15% alcohol, so this is no blushing violet. And it's quite slowly forming some quite heavy tears that are very readily present there on the glass. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? There's a cedary note, and then behind that a slightly subdued black curranty aroma. So let's have a taste. On the palate, the cedar is very to the fore. It really is quite a sort of raw, spicy note. Behind that though, there's lovely, rich, full black currant, black cherry fruit. There's almost a sort of glycerol richness to the wine. 15% alcohol. It doesn't stand out as being big, huge and hot, but it's certainly supporting it. And actually there is some warmth towards the end there that I think is helping to pull out some of those cedary oak notes as well. So despite the lovely, rich, profound, juicy black fruits, there's still quite a drying component to the fine, grainy tannins on the mid-palate. And therefore I think I probably would agree with the idea that this is a wine that probably ideally wouldn't be touched for another few years. I don't think you'd regret drinking it now, but it'd probably be best served with something like a nice juicy steak, something that would help absorb and balance those tannins, because they're still very to the fore. But really the impressive thing about this is the quantity, the quality, the density of this sort of lovely, rich, juicy black fruit. Its smooth glycerol nature, starting out as cassis but moving very quickly more to black cherry, almost a very ripe black plum. And in fact I think actually right at the middle of my palate, a more savoury black olive sort of hint. And yes, that continues through on the finish, where there is that juicy black cherry, but also that more savoury note on the finish. Still a young wine, but one that seems to show an impressive potential to age. And while there is some warmth on the palate, it certainly doesn't feel like it's got 15% of alcohol. Now I note that the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this wine is 96 out of 100. I think really that's based more on the wine's opulence, richness, and probably on the idea that that is a wine that will develop, rather than necessarily its absolute drinking ability at the moment. I'd be pretty happy to have this in my cellar for the next 4 or 5 years and then drink it for 10-15 years after that. It's an impressive wine with lovely intensity, good structure. Emirates as an airline pride themselves on the quality of their wine, and I think this is a good example of some of the exciting and interesting wines that they do put on their range. As a wine lover, I always think it's worth checking out the range of wines they have available here in the Business Class Lounge in Dubai. Sometimes you do find yourself something quite special to try. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, do please press the like button. That would be fantastic. If you'd like to watch more of these videos, it would be great if you consider subscribing to my channel. That way also do set yourself an alert and make sure you're notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the tasting, it would be great if you'd pass it on to them. If you have any comments, please leave those in the comments box below. I'd love to hear what you think of Emirates wine selection, Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon such as this, Cabernet-based Chilean wines, or anything else related to this wine or any of the other wines I'm tasting. I will of course leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, should you wish to find out if it's available in your market and how much it costs. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope you'll manage to make some time and come and watch another tasting video with me sometime in the very near future. Till then, bye for now. I thought this was a really interesting comparison. First of all, I was quite impressed at how similar themes seem to run through the various notes. It's always nice to feel that maybe your tasting is competent. But secondly, my conclusion was that in the case of this wine, and thinking about the other wines I'd tried in the air, conditions of tasting under pressure at altitude made the wines taste more opulent. It was interesting that with the donmelchor, the aromas I was getting in the aircraft were much more of the elegant red fruit end of the spectrum, whereas on the ground, on the nose, I saw much more of the dark fruit and the cedar coming through. My tasting in the air mentions red fruit, but very quickly I'm talking about opulent, dark, black fruit, black cherries, dark plum. The other thing that I think is quite interesting, although I'm slightly torn in both cases as to whether the donmelchor is actually too young to drink or not, on the ground I come down on the side of the argument that it needs longer to age, whereas in the air I find it much more acceptable. So from that I'd conclude that younger red wines would generally become more approachable when consumed on a plane. Thinking back to my remarks on the other wines, the Sancerre, my thoughts were that was richer than you'd normally expect from a Sancerre. Highly possibly some of that is to do with the fact that the acidity was dumbed down a little by the air pressure in the plane. The Chardonnay that was served, the Vivier, is actually quite an elegant style anyway. So I think that's quite a cleverly chosen wine, because in the air it's likely to show in a sort of a slightly richer, less lean style. The Saint-Emilion, coming from a ripe vintage, actually seemed very rich. And there the conditions, I think, had enhanced its opulence. Finally, coming to the Chassagne Montrachet, I think I'm clearly having an issue understanding the acidity there. I think possibly what I meant was that the softness of the acidity stood out. Certainly all the other elements were in a fantastic harmony. So yes, do compare the two tastings of the donmelchor and see what you think about my conclusions. The other thing I would perhaps say, and this is actually finishing with a criticism of Emirates, is that maybe both the donmelchor that I tasted in Dubai and the Chassagne Montrachet that I tasted on the plane were perhaps getting a little tired. Thinking about it, I think it's possible that some of the wines being served in the lounge may be wines that have come off flights where the whole bottle hasn't been consumed. Possibly the wines are just open in the lounge for quite a while. But either way, my tasting notes for the donmelchor in the lounge don't note the fresh red fruits on the aromas and demonstrate more of the cedar and earthy note. That to me could also be a sign that the wine has been open for longer. Similarly, when I tasted the Chassagne Montrachet, that was towards the end of a 6-hour flight. And possibly it wasn't quite as fresh as it would have tasted when it had just been opened. So I think my conclusion about that is this is something Emirates could address by perhaps using a wine preservation system, or by better implementing whatever wine preservation system they have. There are a number of devices that will either pull air out of a bottle, reducing the amount of oxygen there and so slowing oxidation, or alternatively replace it with inert gas. I think it's possible that the use or better implementation of such systems could actually make a substantial difference to the freshness of the wines I've been trying. I hope that's a constructive criticism, because I don't really want to end on a negative note here, because this was a fantastic trip where I tried and really enjoyed some wonderful wines. So thank you for coming along and joining me. I should also say the entire of this series hasn't finished yet, because in a couple of weeks I will be publishing the 4 videos I made on my trip back to Auckland. Unfortunately, there wasn't an upgrade forthcoming there, so you will get to see me drinking white wine out of a plastic cup in economy class. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope you'll come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.